That's what it's all about for me, is spreading that inspiration, right? And I love the image of one candle lighting another, you know,
Mm-hmm.
because our flame is never diminished by lighting another's flame. There's that moment of spark and of ignition where the fire grows, right? And I love that sensation, and that is what I experience in creative collaboration. So um, I love that image.
Yeah. I wanted to touch on like the connection and like the like almost calling it an audience or finding an audience, spreading your work to an audience. It makes it even like sound a little too formal, I think. But I think what we're getting at is, that sharing process of like creating something and sharing it with another person, and that maybe, yeah, keeps the spiral going, and that person might get inspired in a different way, in their own way. Um, and I guess kind of the add-on question is like, maybe in practical terms, like how have you found like putting your work out there and reaching that audience? Like, is it really that collaborative process that broadens the scope and allows more people to reach it? Is this something that just kind of like, just happenstance of like, oh, this thing caught on a little bit more than the last thing? How have you found kind of that building process of reaching people who maybe not aren't like literally right next to you, and like you can say, here it is in real, in real life?
Right. Yeah, it's interesting now that we're all sharing art in digital space. It feels very different, doesn't it? Because there's a couple different answers to that question, the beautiful layers of that question. But I want to speak to that experience of releasing something digitally, because this album that I've just spent 2 years working on, there are 12 pieces of poetry and music encapsulated there. And the process of releasing it out into the world has been so interesting, because it's not happening in my real life. It's not happening in my day-to-day. It's happening somewhere out there in digital space. And I have set these little creations free, and now they're traveling around the world. When I released my first single on September 1st, I watched as within the first 30 days, that song had been played in 72 countries. And it's wild to think that it's spreading out to Cambodia and to the southern reaches of Africa and across Europe and South America. All the while, I'm not experiencing any of that on the creator side. So that's a really interesting concept. But the inverse of that experience is, as a new creator especially, I really called on my discipline to do two things. Number one, create the work first before I gave any thought to who was going to consume it, and seal that container, because then promoting it and releasing it is a completely separate thing. And number two, to allow myself to not focus on numbers at all, because numbers are very arbitrary, right? Especially when you're releasing music. Like, as a musical artist, I can look at the release numbers that Beyonce's experiencing, and that could make me feel very small in this world. But rather than taking that approach of focusing on numbers, I've really paid deep attention to how I impact individuals. And I have watched some of my very favorite musicians, and some of the most compelling musical performances of my life have been played to remarkably small audiences. The first really big poetry reading that I gave at a festival in Brooklyn, I think I had a 2 a.m. time slot, and the audience was so small, but that night my husband was in that audience. And it was my first opportunity to perform a set of my poetry for his ears to receive. So I really focused on the experience of that one person receiving and feeling my work, and let that be the source of my validation, keeping it really personal. So that's something that I would invite other artists to call upon. And then, the next step in answering that question is about collaborating with others. And collaborating with others can be a beautiful way to connect us with other audiences, which I love. But it can also be an incredible way to really feel seen as an artist, which gives us so much more fuel for the fire. When I was making this album, I did a lot of the primary composing of the music with a really talented engineer, producer, musician named Ben Leinbach. And he's been in the music world for many decades, and I'm brand new to it. But I was just as pleased and amazed by what he was offering musically as he was surprised and delighted by what I was offering with my poetry. And so there were these moments in the creative process where we were seeing each other and really seeing the unique value of each other's work. And for me, that's all it takes, is to experience that reflection in one other person who's really paying attention for me to feel like it's worth it, right? So those are some of the ways that the music has spread out. But I, as an artist, I know a lot of artists like to keep really tight reins when they're creating something, and they don't want to let others in until it's finished. I have almost the opposite approach. I really think of myself as like one tree in a forest when it comes to expressing my creativity. And I know that the health and vitality of what I'm doing are really increased by the health and vitality of every other living organism around me. So I want to encourage that interplay and that exchange, because that's what gives the project more life. So that's definitely been true of this experience of collaboration. And yeah, I wonder how that lands for either of you.
The only thing I would add, just to like, because I think it's an interesting, um, even like point of clarification maybe, because at first you said, it's important to have a tight seal on my like creative container. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but that does include the collaborative, like they're part of the creative process. So it's not just me
Yes.
isolated, one person creating and then publish out into the world. But I see what you mean. It's the creative process in the sense of the collaborative creative process. Keep that as kind of like, you know, something that you go through as a fully formed, you know, whatever your process is, and then ready to publish, ready to put out there, without, like you said, without worrying too much. Like, are people going to like it? That kind of question is probably wise to set aside while you're making something.